The old castle stood on a hill, like a frozen guardian, forgotten by time. Its dark towers and crumbling battlements reached into the low clouds, and on stormy evenings, it seemed to be giving birth to the storm itself. No one knew exactly how old it was. The old people said that it had been there before the village below, as if it had grown out of the stone with the hill. The locals didn't approach it, except for a few teenagers who, in a drunken display of bravado, decided to prove their courage to each other. But they returned quickly, their faces white and their hands shaking, and they avoided telling anyone what they had seen inside. In the village, it was known by various names: the Black Hill, the House of the Guardian, and the Fortress of the Dead. No one knew exactly who built it. There were rumors that a baron once lived there, a cruel man who took young peasant girls and never returned. Others claimed that the castle belonged to a black alchemist who made a deal with forces whose names were forbidden to be spoken. But they all agreed on one thing: the castle was alive, and what lived inside was restless. They talked about a ghost, a tall figure in an old-fashioned jacket, with a face as pale as chalk and eyes that burned with a dark light. He walked through the corridors and whispered words that chilled the bones. His footsteps could be heard when the castle was empty, and sometimes, on particularly quiet nights, the echo of a cry could be heard from the hill. Jonathan Hale knew all these stories. He was born in the same village, grew up listening to whispers about the castle, and from childhood he vowed that one day he would solve its mystery. Over the years, his desire only grew stronger. As he grew up, he became a historian and moved to the city to study, but his thoughts never left the castle. It seemed as if the silhouette on the horizon, with its empty windows, was calling him back, and eventually he returned. That day, it was raining heavily, and the road to the hill was a muddy mess. But Jonathan didn't stop. He had a backpack on his back and a flashlight in his hand. He wanted to spend the night inside the castle. He wanted to write down everything he found and finally understand why the castle was still standing. People had been avoiding it for centuries, but that was just superstition. That's what he told himself, even though his heart was beating faster than ever. The castle gates were half destroyed, one of the doors lying on the ground, covered in moss. The courtyard was silent, and the air smelled of dampness. The stone walls, weathered by time, were wet, and raindrops trickled down them like sweat. Inside, the large hall smelled of rotten wood and dust. However, the air was not empty. It felt as if someone had just passed through, leaving a sense of presence. Jonathan turned on the flashlight, and the light picked out the old tapestries hanging on the walls. There were hunting scenes on them, but the faces of the riders and dogs were strange, distorted, as if the artist had painted them in a fit of terror. He ran his hand over one of the paintings, and the fabric crumbled at the touch. He took out a notebook and made the first entry. The castle really feels alive. Every rustle, every echo reverberates in my chest. I feel like I'm not alone here. The wind rustled somewhere in the distance, and a whisper passed through the hall, indistinct but cold. Jonathan shuddered, but forced himself to smile. Drafts. The stone corridors were designed in such a way that the sound echoed through them, changing as if someone were speaking nearby. He continued on his way. The corridors were long and gloomy, and the floor was covered with dust and debris. Occasionally, he would come across a door leading to a room that was empty, except for old furniture covered with white sheets that had turned yellow with age. In one of the rooms, he found a mirror covered in cobwebs. He brushed the cobwebs away and looked at his reflection. For a moment, he thought he saw a tall figure in a coat standing behind him. However, when he turned around, there was no one there. It was just darkness. He made a note in his notebook. The first vision. Perhaps it was fatigue, but the reflection looked too real. A thunderstorm was rumbling outside, but inside the castle the sounds were muffled, as if the walls were blocking out the world. He found the library. There were books in leather bindings, blackened with age. When he opened one, the pages crumbled to dust, but a few words remained. "Don't sleep. He's coming." Jonathan felt his skin crawl, and then he heard footsteps, heavy, slow, like someone in boots walking across a stone floor. They weren't echoes, they weren't wind, they were approaching. Jonathan turned off the lantern, his heart beating so hard he was afraid the sound would give him away. In the hallway, beyond the library door, he could hear breathing, deep, as if someone who hadn't felt air in a long time was learning to breathe again. The door creaked slightly. Jonathan closed his eyes, trying to be quiet. Everything inside him was screaming, "Run away," but he stayed. When he turned on the flashlight again, the door was open. There's no one in the hallway, but there were footprints on the stone floor. They were wet, as if someone had walked barefoot through puddles and entered. He made a note in his notebook. "I'm not alone." Jonathan crouched down next to the footprints. They were strange. The fingerprints were elongated, as if they were too long, unnatural. He ran the flashlight across the floor, but the footprints went deeper into the corridor, disappearing into the shadows. He clenched his teeth and followed. Every step was difficult, as if the air in the corridor thickened, enveloping him and making it difficult to move. It seemed as if the castle itself was against him moving forward. But something stubborn and hot burned within him, a curiosity that bordered on madness. The corridor led him to a high-ceilinged hall. Torches that had been extinguished hundreds of years ago lined the walls. In the center of the hall stood a stone sarcophagus. Its lid was tilted to one side, and darkness gaped inside. Jonathan smelled it thick, rotten, like the smell of earth just dug up. He moved closer, shone his torch inside, and saw the remains of clothes inside the sarcophagus. Torn, but no bones. It was empty. And then a voice spoke behind him. "You've come after all." The torch shook in his hand. The beam swept across the room, but there was no one there. Jonathan slowly turned around. Nothing. Just the pillars and the sarcophagus. But the voice was too close, as if it were being spoken directly into the ear. "I've been waiting for you." His chest went cold. Jonathan took a step back, but the sarcophagus was right behind him. He felt something cold touch his arm. He jerked away, throwing the lantern to the side, and the light fell on a figure in the corner of the room. A tall silhouette in an old coat. The face was white and dead, with two black holes for eyes that emitted a dull, eerie glow. A ghost. Jonathan wanted to scream, but the sound stuck in his throat. The creature took a step forward, and each step echoed in the floor, though its feet barely touched the stone. "You opened the door for me," the ghost said. "I've been here for so long. Too long." And at that moment, Jonathan realized that he had made a mistake. It wasn't the castle that was keeping the ghost. The castle was a cage. And he, the curious historian, had opened that cage by simply entering it. The ghost reached out its hand, and the air in the hall immediately turned icy. Frost formed on the stone walls, and Jonathan's breath turned into steam. He broke away from the ghost and ran. The corridors flashed before his eyes, and he didn't know where his feet were taking him. The castle was alive. The walls seemed to change places. Doors disappeared, and new ones appeared. He ran, stumbling, feeling the approach of something that did not belong to this world. At some point, he entered a narrow passage leading to a spiral staircase. He climbed up, taking 2 steps at a time. His heart was racing, and his chest was tight. At the top floor, he found himself in a long corridor with windows. The rain was beating against the broken stained glass, and the wind was blowing in. However, when he looked out, he realized that the castle was deceiving him even here. There was no village or hill outside the windows, only an endless night and a strange movement in the darkness, as if someone was walking there, below, waiting. The ghost was nearby. Its silhouette was reflected in every glass, and it seemed to be walking beside me, without touching the ground. Jonathan ran into the nearest door. It was a bedroom, with a huge bed with a torn canopy, a dresser, and a heavy-framed mirror. He slammed the door shut and pushed against it with his shoulder, but he knew the lock wouldn't hold. In the mirror, he saw himself. His face was pale, and his eyes were wild, but behind his reflection was the same silhouette. It was slowly raising its hand. The room smelled of rot. "You're mine now," a voice whispered in his head. "You'll stay here, like me." Jonathan rushed to the window. He didn't think, he just jumped. The glass shattered and the cold rain struck his face. He fell, expecting a blow, but there was no blow. He fell for too long, as if the ground had disappeared. And when he finally touched something solid, he realized that he was standing on the floor of the library, where it all began. The castle was playing with him. The lantern was still where he had dropped it. Jonathan picked it up, and with trembling hands, he turned on the light. On the table was a book, the same one that had said, "Don't sleep. He's coming." Now the words had changed. "You're already here." He realized that there was no way out. Jonathan closed his eyes and tried to breathe. He told himself that it was all a hallucination, caused by fatigue, fear, and the pressure of the old house. But every cell in his body knew that this was not a dream. The castle was holding him inside, closing the circle, and there was no way out. He took a step towards the library door. The floorboards groaned under his feet. The door was half open, and the darkness beyond it breathed like a living thing. Then he heard footsteps again. Heavy, slow footsteps. They were walking straight towards him. Jonathan clutched the lantern in his hand and ran outside. The corridor was empty, but it was as cold as if he had stepped into a winter forest. The stones were covered in frost, and his breath hung in a cloud of steam. Then he heard something worse than footsteps, whispers. "You will stay. You are one of us. We needed you." The voices came from all directions, as if the walls were speaking. He covered his ears with his hands, but it did not help. The whisper was inside my head. He ran. The corridor led him deep into the castle, into a high-ceilinged hall. In the center was a long table, set as if a feast were still in progress. On the plates was meat, blackened, reduced to dust. The goblets were full, but they held not wine, but a thick, dark liquid that smelled of iron. And around the table were people, or what had once been people. Their faces were blank, white as masks. Their eyes were sunken, and their mouths were twisted in silent screams. But when Jonathan entered, their heads turned toward him at the same time.